through some of the cognitive foundations of language. There's going to be kind of a couple different lectures on language. So this is just kind of an overview of some of the basics, and then we'll go through a few of kind of the cognitive, probably call them reasons for the evolution of language, or kind of how language evolved within the primate species. So we'll start off with a couple of kind of terms that we often use in understanding language. And you want to make sure to take a special note of these in terms of knowing what they mean, see what the definitions are, and how they're different from how they're different components of language. So first off is a phoneme, and a phoneme is an individual sound unit. So things like a vowel or a consonant sound. Morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of a particular word. So if we think of things like a base, like the base of a word, so do and undo would be a morpheme because it is the smallest meaningful unit of the word. It's the smallest part of a word that has some sort of meaning. Or something like a prefix, so undo, un has a certain meaning to it. And then things like different forms of inflection, like ing in doing, or s in girls, because s adds a meaning, making something plural. Syntax is the combination of words in phrases and in sentences. So it's basically the same thing as grammar. It's the way that we make meaning out of the words and phrases that we use. A lexicon is a collection of words for any given particular language. So there's an English lexicon. It's the meaning or the collection of all the different words that we have within the English language. And of course, each different language has a different lexicon, whether that be Spanish or French or Chinese. And then semantics are the different meanings that correspond with different lexical entries. So a semantics is the way that we try to define what a word is. And of course, semantics change or can change based on context, so that a word can actually have multiple meanings based on when it is used or how it's used in a sentence or within a paragraph or within a particular context. Is the way in which we use different types of vocal intonations to modify the semantic meaning of a particular word. So for example, if I was using more of a sarcastic tone when I was saying a particular word, that would modify the meaning of the word and what I was trying to convey to someone versus if I was trying to say something more straightforwardly. So prosody is the way in which we can use our vocal intonations to modify how a word is actually understood. Discourse is linking of sentences into a meaningful narrative. When we look at the evolution of language within primates, there's kind of several different things that we want to look at. So we can kind of look at how, at least within non-human primates, how do we go from the kind of communications that non-human primates can do and ultimately get to the place where we have language such as ours, that is able to speak words, that is able for those words to have meanings, and is able to communicate so well with one another. So there's several important questions that we look at in terms of the evolution of language. First, what are the similarities between primates in regard to a communication and comprehension? And then what differentiates human language from other forms of animal communication? So we know that animals are able to communicate something with each other. They're able to give some sort of signal or some sort of way of kind of letting other letting other animals know certain kinds of things. So what is it that makes human language unique? What kind of differentiates it? Now, the first kind of basic thing that we can see in terms of humans and other animals is simply imitation. So we can think of different animals that can actually mimic the sounds of human language. So if you think about like an example of like a parrot can mimic or imitate the words that you're saying. It can kind of copy those same words and parrot it. That's why the word is often called parrot it back to you or imitate it back to you. So we're able to copy the sounds of human language. So we've seen this in seals, parrots, dogs. If you've ever seen some of those online videos of like goats that make kind of weird, almost human-sounding sounds when they're laughing or those kinds of things, it's obvious that certain animals can sound like we can. But of course, they aren't communicating in the same way using language as we can. So the difference must lie in something besides merely the production of words and phrases. What differentiates human language skills from other animals isn't simply producing the same kinds of sounds, but there's some other cognitive reason. There's some other way in which humans are able to interpret those sounds between each other that really makes it different for us. One kind of difference that we can see within human beings and especially within chimpanzees is in terms of vocalizations. So there's three different primary components of vocalization. One is respiratory, and that's the outward flow of air. So whenever we're making the different words that we're making with our mouths, we are blowing air out. And we are using air in certain ways. And then we also phonatory is another part of a vocalization. So the vibration of our vocal cords allows us also to produce sounds. And then finally, articulatory, and that's the movements of the mouth. So whenever we're making different words or different sounds, our mouths are forming in different sorts of ways, and then the respiratory acts of blowing that air out through our mouths. It is what causes words and us to make the sounds that actually make up what words are. Now, if we look at primates, non-human primates, we see that there's certain types of limitations in terms of how the kinds of vocalizations that they can do. Basically, humans can do more types of vocalizations. We have more motor control over our mouths and a different set of vocalization abilities that differentiate us from other non-human primates, especially chimpanzees and great apes. So adult humans have a larger pharynx or a larger throat, and we also have a lower larynx or voice box. These two differences in anatomy between us and other great apes allows us to make the unique sounds necessary for human language. So one limitation that we want to be aware of is that even if certain kinds of non-human primates could cognitively understand what we're doing or saying or thinking, they cannot vocalize those things in exactly the same way that we can. And that's one of the big differences between us and, say, for example, chimpanzees. Though we will look at here in a little bit bonobo chimpanzees who do have a certain amount of symbolic processing powers or abilities. So, thinking more about these primate limitations, humans have the ability to shape our mouths into several different positions, to utter different kinds of sounds. So it allows us to make all these different, our ability to form our mouths and the fine motor skills that we use in terms of moving our lips and the way that we can force the breath out of our teeth, mouths, the use of our tongues, and our lips allow for different kinds of sounds. Chimpanzees are more limited in these types of vocalizations to only 32 and have a very limited articulation component to what they can do. Most of human language is articulated through vowels, which are more open positions, and consonants, which are more closed positions. And those two types of positions that we make up the basics of what human language is, because of course most of human language is nouns, which are things, and then verbs, which are more of action sorts of words. So, not for non-human primates, vocalizations are primarily controlled by connections to the midbrain. And what this does is this primarily associates vocalization with arousal and with emotion. And what that tells us is that for most animals, when they are doing some sort of sound or trying to signal to other conspecifics of their specific species, it's coming from more of an emotional or a arousal sort of state. So a lot of those vocalizations are more coming out of things like fear or uncertainty, anger, and those kinds of things, which limits more of the kinds of things that many animals can do with language. It's more about warning signals and displays of dominance, showing different kinds of emotions. Whereas for us, obviously, language is not always associated with particular emotions. There's other things we can do that aren't strictly limited to different kinds of emotional features. So human brain evolution increased connections from the prefrontal cortex to areas of the brain that control vocalization. So because most non-human primate vocalization, they're more connected to the midbrain, and if we think of the midbrain as more connected to the brainstem, those are more kind of basic, more emotional, more arousal sorts of actions. Whereas for us, because it's connected to our prefrontal cortex, we know that the prefrontal cortex is more related to things like goals, planning, and more cognitive and not necessarily fully emotional or arousal-based kinds of sounds and communication. So that was one of the big differences. We also know that human prefrontal cortex is enlarged within human beings in comparison to other non-human primates, such as the chimpanzee. We have the largest prefrontal cortex and the most amount of connections from the prefrontal cortex to other areas of the brain. So what this did is it allowed for the suppression of vocalizations simply associated with arousal. So for example, sooner or later you may hear my dog barking. And my dog, when he gets really scared, he gets anxious, and he immediately stops barking. He cannot control or stop those types of sounds. Whereas human beings do not necessarily have to, anytime we are aroused or become excited, we don't necessarily have to begin to make certain kinds of sounds. And the prefrontal cortex is what allows for the suppression of those kinds of emotional or arousal-based expressions that we try to communicate. What this did is it allowed for the development of more sophisticated forms of vocalization, allowed us to do more kind of things like scientific reasoning, rational reasoning, those kinds of things that allow us to do different kinds of things with language. This also allowed for the development of symbolic language, our ability to use language or use words in more of a symbolic sort of way. So when we look at primate vocalization, now what's interesting is, we talked about the fact that for the most part, primate vocalization has been associated with arousal and emotion. But there are certain kinds of species of non-human primates that have been able to do pretty unique things with the vocalizations that they have. So probably one of the interesting examples of this is the vervet monkey. And I'll post a video about the vervet monkeys that you can watch and kind of see about their different types of calls. And so vervet monkeys have different types of calls that are associated with different types of predators. And based on the type of predator that is signaled by one of the vervet monkeys, it changes the types of behaviors that they do, or the ways that they try to avoid that particular a predator. So, for example, when a leopard comes, the vervet monkeys call to each other, and all of the monkeys climb into the trees because obviously the leopards are on the ground, and so trying to get out of the way of the leopard and up into the tree is much safer. Same thing when an eagle is about. They actually do the exact opposite. They jump out of the trees and try to hide more in the bushes. And so what's interesting is that there's two different types of calls. It's a different type of calls, and those calls indicate different kinds of predators, which correspond to different kinds of avoidance behaviors. Finally, when the snake call is given, they rise up and they peer into the bushes. And this allows them to try to search for the snakes and try to avoid the snakes that may be on the ground. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. This is definitely a precursor to language. It's probably not full-blown language as we would know it, but it's definitely the association of different sounds with different kinds of predators and different kinds of corresponding behaviors. And probably what's most important is what is communicated between these monkeys is very useful for their survival. Now, one of the problems that most monkeys have is doing things more in regard to symbols. What vervet monkeys do is more in regards to a type of a indexical sort of reference, meaning a certain call is indexed to a particular type of a predator, whereas a symbolic reasoning is often very different. So when chimpanzees are presented with two different piles of desirable food, and one is larger than the other, the chimpanzees tend to choose the large pile, and then they tend to receive it. So if you have two chimpanzees, they both have two large piles of food in front of them. They, of course, want the larger pile because it's more food, so they choose that and they get it. But what happens is the evil researchers later on, the chimpanzees choose the pile that goes to the second chimpanzee. So whenever they make their choice, they're actually choosing the pile that goes to someone else. So the problem is, can they hold themselves back and symbolically understand that if I want to point to the smaller pile, it will go towards someone else, and then I will get the bigger pile. The problem is that chimpanzees have difficulty doing that. They have difficulty kind of resisting that initial impulse to grab for or to want, to desire the larger pile. So chimpanzees have a very large difficulty trying to figure out this problem. It's very difficult for them to get to the point of realizing that to get the big pile, I have to choose the small pile. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at us, when you look at human beings, young children figure this out very quickly. They're very quickly able to catch on to the fact that if I choose the small pile, I can get the big pile. And this once again goes back to the ability to suppress basic kinds of inclinations and instincts to try to get what you desire or to get what you want. And human children are actually pretty good at this, whereas chimpanzees tend to not be as good at this particular skill. Okay, now finally, so we've talked a lot about how symbolic processing seems to be unique in humans, and it's probably not the case that it's unique. Instead, it's probably that we're better at symbolic reasoning than other types of primates. Other types of non-human primates, such as chimpanzees, have more difficulty with symbolic reasoning than we do. We are just simply better at it. But it doesn't mean that they are completely incapable of it. And probably the most famous example of this is a chimpanzee named a Kanzi. And so a Kanzi is a male bonobo at the Great Ape Trust in Iowa. And Kanzi began learning different kinds of symbolic reference when he was actually a child. And he was actually clinging to his foster mother, Matata, during her training sessions. So what's interesting about this particular case is Kanzi was not directly being taught to. Instead, he was simply picking up on the types of instruction that his adoptive mother was actually receiving. And so it's one of the interesting things that this kind of began to point out is that there's something about growing up in a language culture that actually helps in terms of chimpanzees being able to do more types of a symbolic reference. So as he grew up, he quickly surpassed other trained adult bonobos. And it's kind of like by being in that culture, really, he began to understand more and more words and more a symbolic reference. So when his training began, he already knew most of what his trainers wanted to teach. So it kind of gives weight to this idea of, part of language acquisition is simply growing up in a culture that contains language. And if we think about small children, the more you talk in front of your children, even before they're able to actually utter the words, they're actually still picking up on important aspects of language. And it's those parts of language it's those important parts of language that they kind of pick up on that allow them to actually understand how language works. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a couple more YouTube videos up about Kanzi, as well as about the vervet monkeys, so make sure to look through those as well. And this will be kind of lecture 1 on language. So have a good rest of your day.